Welcome back to the show. Today, today we're diving into the sometimes complicated world of public housing
Hmm.
policies and how some of these changes are impacting families who are considered vulnerable,
Right.
particularly families who are often labeled as
Yes.
hard to house,
Hmm.
which we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah.
But basically, it
Yeah.
should be eye-opening for a lot of our listeners, I think.
Absolutely. We're focusing specifically on the Hope 6 program.
Right.
And as you know, this program was initially intended to revitalize distressed public housing, but, the question
Yeah.
is it really working for everyone?
Yeah. Is it working?
Hmm.
And for whom is it working?
Right.
And who is it not working for?
Exactly.
So that's kind of what we're diving into today,
Yeah.
because especially with Hope 6, relying so heavily on things like mixed income housing and vouchers,
Uh-huh.
which on paper,
Right.
the concept of deconcentrating poverty, giving residents more choice,
Oh, choice. Right.
sounds great,
Yeah.
but
Sounds fantastic, but
in reality,
in reality,
it's a little bit more complicated.
yeah, and especially for those who are considered hard to house.
Right.
So this deep dive is going to look at, the challenges these families face, and we're going to be using as our guide a 2005 study from the Urban Institute,
Okay, great.
which is really fascinating.
And one of the first things that jumped out at me from this study
Yeah.
was just the fact that
Uh-huh.
there isn't a universally accepted definition of what hard to house actually means.
Right.
Which
It's a loaded term, isn't it?
it's a very loaded term.
Yeah.
And it kind of,
And I think that highlights
Yeah.
a real lack of understanding of the
Yeah.
complexities that these families are facing, right?
right.
This study particularly focuses on public housing residents who are at risk of losing their homes because of these policy changes.
Okay.
So not just anyone experiencing homelessness,
Gotcha.
but specifically public housing residents who are at risk of losing their homes because of these policy changes.
Gotcha.
And within that group, they identify six
Yeah.
categories of residents who might fall under the hard to house umbrella.
Okay.
And I think what's important to
Yeah.
frame it in a way that people can
Right.
relate to. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, for instance, think about families who have been in public housing for generations,
Yep.
dealing with things like unemployment, low education levels, and maybe substance abuse or past criminal records.
Oh,
The study refers to these as multiple barrier households.
right.
And so they're facing this real uphill battle
Right.
to find stable housing. And
It's like they're trapped in that cycle.
it is.
Okay.
And then you have families with members who have disabilities.
Right.
And they need accessible housing. And in many cities, finding an affordable and accessible apartment is next to impossible.
It's really hard.
And the private market is often not equipped to meet those needs, especially when it comes to specific accessibility
Right.
requirements.
Oh, it can be very challenging.
Yes.
And then we can't forget about seniors who have maybe aged in place
Mm-hmm.
in public housing, who rely on maybe familiar support networks within those communities.
Right.
Uprooting them
Mhm.
and expecting them to kind of navigate a new environment
Yeah.
can be really disruptive,
Yeah.
especially if their healthcare needs are increasing.
Right. Because for them, it's not just a roof over their
Not
heads.
the community.
It's a community that they've built over decades.
Exactly.
And those close-knit relationships can be really vital to
Right.
their well-being.
To the well-being.
So
And then you have
you have grandparents raising grandchildren.
grand families.
Yeah. Which the researchers label grandfamilies.
I mean, talk about trying to find housing that works for
yes.
both an older adult and for young children. I mean,
And
that's a unique challenge.
that is, and it speaks to a larger societal issue that we're seeing, the increasing number of grandparents
Right.
stepping in to care for their grandchildren
Right.
due to various factors, often
And with limited
with
resources.
limited resources. Yeah.
And then, of course, you have large households, families with 4 or more children.
Yes.
I mean, just try and find an apartment that can accommodate a family that size in a competitive housing market.
Exactly. Especially an affordable apartment.
Oh, especially.
It's a logistical nightmare.
It's a logistical nightmare. And then there's the category the researchers call households with one-strike problems.
Yes.
And these are families that are at risk of eviction because a member has a criminal history.
And that gets into some
Trees.
really challenging territory.
Yeah.
Because even if someone has served their time, this one strike can follow them for years.
Right.
Making it really difficult
To secure housing.
to secure housing, exactly.
It's like they're being punished over and over again.
It is.
Right now, you might be thinking, well, that's a lot of categories, but how widespread is this issue?
Right.
Well, what I thought was so interesting is that the researchers didn't just define these categories,
Yeah.
they actually went out and analyzed data
Mm-hmm.
from 5 different Hope 6 sites
Right.
across the country.
Yeah.
And what they found was pretty shocking.
In some cities, like Chicago, for instance,
Yeah.
the percentage of residents in targeted developments who fell into one or more of these
Mm.
hard-to-house categories was incredibly high. It
Yeah.
was shocking, actually.
Yeah, staggering 62% to be exact.
Yeah.
And remember, this isn't the entire homeless population.
Right.
This is just the segment of public housing residents
Yeah.
who are at risk of being displaced.
Because of these policy changes.
Yeah, because of these policies.
Yeah.
So it raises some serious questions about, like,
yeah,
the effectiveness
about the effectiveness of the
of the
programming.
Hope 6 program,
Uh-huh.
right? And whether it's really meeting the needs
Right.
of the most vulnerable residents.
Yeah. And so the next question becomes, well,
Yeah, where do they go?
if it's not serving them, then what happens to them?
Yeah, what happens?
Where do they go?
Where do they go?
Yeah, it's a crucial question, and one that I think the researchers really explore in depth.
Okay.
You know, what they find is that these policies that are intended to improve public housing
Right.
might actually be making things more difficult.
Okay, so we've established that a good portion of these public housing residents fit into these categories.
Right.
But how are these policies, which are supposed to be helping, how are they making things harder?
Well, so take the reliance on vouchers, for example.
Okay.
The assumption is that everyone can seamlessly transition into the private rental market.
Mm-hmm.
But for those with disabilities, large families, or people with criminal records,
Right.
it's not that simple.
It's not as easy.
Finding landlords who are willing to rent to them can be
Yeah, it's almost impossible.
incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's like setting them up for failure in a way.
It is.
Because it's not just about finding a place. It's about keeping it.
Exactly.
And, you know, a lot of these folks are dealing with all these additional hurdles, like maintaining employment, managing finances, addressing health issues, all these things that can make it really hard to stay housed.
Yeah, and the voucher program as it stands
Right.
wasn't designed to really address those things.
Right.
You know, it's primarily a financial tool.
Right. It's not a solution.
It's not a holistic solution.
So you're giving someone a life raft, but you're not teaching them to swim.
Exactly.
And then what about the loss of those deeply subsidized public housing units?
Right.
That seems like a huge blow, especially for those who really need that extra support.
That's a really critical point, and the Urban Institute research
Uh-huh.
really highlights a significant decrease
Yeah.
in the number of these units, often without a clear plan
Right.
for what's going to happen to the most vulnerable residents
Who are depending on them.
who depended on them. Exactly.
It's like we're pulling the rug out from under them.
It is.
And this really ties back to the concept of deconcentrating poverty, right?
Right.
Like the goal is great, but it's like, hold on, you can't just displace people and expect everything to magically fall into place.
Exactly. You know, we have to consider
Such a consequence.
the unintended consequences of that.
Yeah, because moving people to different neighborhoods doesn't necessarily solve the challenges that they're facing.
Right. In some cases, it might actually make things worse.
So what's the solution? I mean, I know it's easy to get bogged down in the problems,
Right.
but I'm really interested in, like,
Yeah.
what alternatives the researchers kind of propose here.
Well, the good news is
Okay.
they don't just highlight the problems.
Right.
They actually offer some concrete recommendations.
Okay, good.
And what's so fascinating about it is their emphasis on tailoring housing options and support services
Go
to
on.
meet the specific needs of each.
Ah, so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Not at all.
More like a
It's like a tailored suit.
tailored to each individual need.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So they propose 6 main alternatives.
Okay.
First, they emphasize the importance of search assistance and post-move support.
Okay.
This goes beyond just finding an apartment.
Mm-hmm.
It involves things like counseling, guidance with things like bureaucratic hurdles, connecting people with resources in their new communities.
So they have like a guide, someone to hold their hand through this.
Exactly. Someone to walk with them.
Especially for people who don't have those support networks.
Right.
Or don't have that experience living independently.
Yeah, it's like having a guide to navigate this new terrain.
Exactly.
Then there's transitional supportive housing,
Okay.
which provides temporary housing coupled with what are called wraparound services
Okay.
to help families kind of get back on their feet.
So it's more of a stepping stone,
A stepping stone,
not
right?
a permanent solution.
Yeah, it's about empowering them to regain stability and self-sufficiency.
Gotcha.
And then for those with more long-term needs,
Yeah.
there's permanent supportive housing,
Okay.
which provides that ongoing support.
Right.
You have things like on-site case management,
Mm-hmm.
mental health services, job training,
Oh, wow.
all within a stable housing environment.
That seems crucial for people with disabilities or those facing chronic homelessness.
Yeah, it's about addressing those underlying issues
Right.
that contribute to housing
Just
instability.
get to the root of the problem.
Exactly.
Right.
And then recognizing the dire shortage of appropriate housing,
Uh,
they advocate for more large and accessible units.
Right.
You'd accommodate larger families and those with mobility challenges.
Like, yeah, you can't expect a family of 6 to thrive in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment.
Excessively, everyone needs space to breathe, space to grow.
Right. Yeah.
And then there's this option of service-enriched SRO units.
SRO.
Which are single-room occupancy units
Okay.
for individuals who might not need that full-blown supportive housing, but could benefit from some additional support.
So it's all about having that range of options
It is. It's about providing a spectrum.
because not everyone needs that same
Level of support.
level of support.
Exactly.
Okay.
And finally, they underscore the need for counseling and support tailored specifically for families
Okay.
dealing with those one-strike issues
Mhm.
related to past criminal records.
That's so important because we got to break that cycle of punishment.
Absolutely.
Everyone deserves a second chance.
Right.
And that includes having a safe and stable place to call home.
And it's about giving those families the tools and the resources
Yeah.
that they need to address those challenges.
To thrive.
Prevent future instability.
But let's be realistic.
Yeah,
These solutions require a lot of resources, right?
they do.
Money, personnel.
Right.
And, in a world where budgets are shrinking,
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to see how these folks could get overlooked.
That's where the researchers really drive home the point
Yeah.
that federal and local agencies, especially those that are receiving these Hope 6 grants,
Mm-hmm.
have a moral obligation
Okay.
to prioritize the needs of these hard-to-house folks.
They're basically saying you can't just tear down these developments and walk away.
Exactly.
You have to make sure that everybody has a place to land.
A safe and stable place to land, yeah.
Safely.
And it's not just about preventing homelessness.
Right.
It's about breaking that cycle of poverty
Mm-hmm.
and creating opportunities for these families
To thrive.
to thrive. Exactly.
Think about the kids
Yeah,
growing up in these environments.
that's right.
If we can address these issues now,
Right.
what an impact it could have on future generations.
It could have profound long-term benefits
For everybody.
for communities as a whole.
Right. So it's not just about bricks and mortar. It's about building a system that actually works for everyone.
Exactly. It's about building a more just and equitable housing system for everybody.
Yeah. And that brings us to, I think,
The heart of it.
the heart of what this deep dive is really all about.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the real human cost of these policies
Right.
and what we can do
Yeah.
to create a system that really works for those who need it most.
Absolutely.
We've been talking a lot about policy and, different models and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's easy to kind of get lost in the abstract. You know what I mean?
Right.
What does this actually look like
Right.
for the families who are experiencing these changes?
Yeah, and I think that's why the researchers
Yeah.
included real stories from people in
Yeah.
their study,
Uh-huh.
to really offer these glimpses
Yeah.
into the lives of folks who are directly impacted.
Like Annie, a grandmother in her late 70s,
Right.
who ended up raising her 3 grandchildren
Yeah.
in Chicago's Ida B. Wells
Mm-hmm.
housing project.
Yeah.
And one of her granddaughters, Keisha, has severe disabilities
Mm.
and needs constant care.
I mean, can you imagine the stress and uncertainty
Oh, my gosh.
for Annie knowing that her building was slated for demolition,
Yeah.
especially given the difficulty of finding a place that could accommodate?
Right. I mean, she needed an accessible unit
Right.
with multiple bedrooms.
Yeah.
Which is really hard to find, even in traditional public housing.
Practically impossible to find.
Yes. And
Both the private market
it's a tough situation.
and traditional public housing, yeah.
And then there's Irene,
Mm-hmm.
an elderly woman who had lived in the same Chicago neighborhood for over 50 years,
Wow.
relied on her son,
Right.
Harold, for care,
Yeah.
but because he had a criminal record, he wasn't allowed to be on the lease.
Oh, wow.
So the relocation plan was to move her into senior housing, which would force her to live alone,
Right.
separated from her family, and she was terrified.
Right. She was terrified of losing her support system and that connection to her community.
Yeah.
It really highlights the need, I think, to...
To consider those individual circumstances.
Yeah, and not just apply these blanket policies.
Yeah, what might work on paper doesn't always work out in the real world.
Exactly.
And then there's Diane,
Mm-hmm.
who's a single mother of 3,
Right.
who had actually, worked her way up to a supervisory position
Mm-hmm.
before falling into a really deep depression after her mother's death.
Oh, wow.
She ended up losing her job, her apartment,
Wow.
ended up homeless, had to rely on the kindness of relatives who are also struggling.
It just shows how quickly
Yeah, it can all fall apart so quickly.
things can unravel and
It can happen to anyone.
how even those who were once self-sufficient
Yeah,
can become hard to house
just because of life circumstances.
due to unforeseen circumstances. Yeah.
So,
So I think these stories, while they're just a snapshot,
mm-hmm.
they provide this really powerful window, I think,
Yeah.
into the human impact
It's not just numbers.
of these policies.
These are real people's lives.
Yeah. It reminds us that we're not just talking about statistics. We're Right. talking about real people's lives.
Yeah, their hopes, their dreams, their struggles.
Totally.
And that's what I think makes this research so important.
Yeah, it is.
It's a real call to action for everyone.
It's a call to action.
To really think about how we can do better.
For those most in need, yeah.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? We've covered a lot today.
Yeah.
We've explored the ins and outs of public housing transformation,
Mm-hmm.
the challenges that these folks are facing,
Right?
and some potential solutions.
Yeah.
But this conversation, it doesn't end here.
It doesn't.
What do you think?
Yeah, what are your thoughts?
What kind of innovative solutions or policies can you think of
Uh-huh.
that might better address the needs of these families?
Yeah.
How can we make sure that public housing transformation benefits everyone,
Right.
not just the people who are easiest to house?
Absolutely.
These are questions that I think are worth asking because this is a responsibility that we all share.
It is.
So until next time, keep diving deep.